So we want to automate our builds because more or less because we can, but also because we need to, because we're talking about just a large number of environments. It's manual is too error prone. DevOps is going to give us this continuous integration and deployment. It is very much goes hand in glove with infrastructure as code. It's like I said earlier, you can't build a physical server with code, but when you get into the cloud, when you talk about virtual machines and virtual resources, you very much can. And if you've ever spent much time going a little bit into the Azure or Amazon Web Services or Google, you'll see that that's a lot of what is there, is how to script out creating all of those different services, which is perfect when you want to be able to do so and replicate an environment. You see this this has been around for a while, even without the cloud, when you've had containers. Docker is another classic script the whole thing out. You can script out a VM, all the different software you want to put on it, and then you're off and running. So instead of saying to a new developer, here's all these different things I need you to install, and you got to try to make sure they all work. Instead, you just give them a Docker script and say, here you go, run this. It's going to spin up a VM and you can go do what you need to with it. With this, with the infrastructure as a code and build automation, there's also a configuration management piece to this, because we've touched on the idea of development and staging and testing and production environments. Those are going to be configured differently, maybe for number of users, maybe for security purposes, maybe the different data sets or resource sources and targets. And so each of these, there is a configuration of those that goes on, as opposed to building something, like the whole infrastructure as code. We're not having to build that whole script, but we do have to send certain parameters into that code when that environment is built. That is your configuration management side. And this again falls under the DevOps auspices. Orchestration is in the same vein as really the infrastructure code in that. And this is making sure that all of these things work together properly, that we are spinning up and turning off situations and resources as needed, that we are integrating them as needed, that we're making sure that the steps that need to be automated are automated properly. So it's things like, on a code commit, do I kick off a build, or do I kick off a test, or do I kick off a code review alert or something like that? And then of course, operations, like the grandfather of operations was just monitoring stuff. Are the systems up? Are they not? Are they working completely? Are they sort of working? Are there issues with them? Performance, is it responding in the time it needs to? Is it a little slow today? Things like that. That still falls into the world of DevOps, because once we get all this stuff out, we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on whether or not it works, whether it's up and functional or not. Because that's sometimes what we run into, is that you've got to, because now DevOps is supporting everybody. So it's not just production where you've got a production server down and people are crying and screaming and saying, hey, I can't get to the server. You may now also have it with your QA people or your developers or anybody like that. So you want to have some monitoring tools or scripts or processes out there to make sure that you're keeping an eye on what is it that is up, what is this functional, what is it's not, and hopefully you're ahead of the game. So if something goes down, you can notify that the group or groups that are impacted by it. So getting better. Oh, I don't know why I have. Okay, I had a couple of slides that I need to yank back out of that. Sometimes you do such things. So let's go back to. So let's talk about the usage of DevOps in various methodologies. How does this fit in? because we've touched on them a little bit, but it's worth it to spend a little time thinking through them. So I'm going to take this a little out of order. So let's look at waterfall first. In the world of waterfall methodology, if you don't remember, you have these steps that are taken in order, and you don't take a next step until the prior step's completed. So you gather requirements, and then when you're done gathering requirements and documenting those, you put together design. And when you're done with the design and have that documented, you go into implementation. When your implementation is done, and you go over to testing. When testing is done, you go to deployment. The DevOps world is not, it pushes against waterfall methodology, because DevOps wants all of those things to be much more fluid and not such hard steps along the way. If you think of with waterfall, you sort of think the reverse would be like a stairway. You take a step and you know where you can't go back. You step up. Okay, now you got to step up to the next one. You can't step back down. And that's sort of the hard and fast rule of waterfall. And with that, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have the continuous integration and deployment, because you don't really have the visibility from the later steps. Like when you're in implementation, you can code and you can deploy, but it doesn't really help the testers because they're not even involved yet, because the coding's not done. So DevOps does push, well, it can work with waterfall, because you still have more or less, in most cases, you're going to have development environments that you could orchestrate and make sure that those are kept in sync, particularly when you get large development teams, so that all the developers have access to what they need to see the system as it's being built. Even if they're not testing it officially, there's some level of that goes on. Plus, integration type steps and work that needs to be done that is much more, it's much more feasible to do that when you've got environments that are similar or ideally the same. And you can compare those, and you can have access to all the different pieces of the system that sometimes you don't have as a developer, and particularly in waterfall. You may be working on one section of code and you never really have an opportunity to see how that integrates with others, because there's no platform where those things can be built together and actually the integration tested. So it can, while DevOps can be, it can grate against some of the waterfall methodology, it can also improve waterfall within each of those steps, with each of those silos, and make things a little more stable, but also just, I guess, get ahead of the game a little bit so that you're more confident coming out of your step, particularly implementation side. You're much more confident that what you built and what you did is correct and will pass testing, as opposed to, I don't know, wrote a bunch of code, think it works, we'll see what happens when you start integrating it. So DevOps, although it may feel very different or not, it may feel completely foreign, actually, I guess, with waterfall, but it's not. It can work with that. Agile is, again, it's going to push Agile to be more agile. When you think about the idea of Scrum and sprints within Agile, you have these 1, 2, 3 week, 4 week, whatever it is, sprints. And at the end of those, you do a build. You bring everything together, you test it, you build it, you deploy it. DevOps says, we can do that more often than that. We don't have to wait every week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. We don't have to wait to the end of a sprint. We can do daily builds. So we can have an insight into how this is all going to flush out at the end of the sprint sooner. Very much like how it can improve waterfall and give us more visibility into what we're doing and what we're producing. DevOps does that in the Agile world. It may make things like deployments at the end of a sprint almost like that's a no-brainer, because if you've got CI/CD already built into it, you've got daily builds, daily deployments, and the only difference is at the end of a sprint, maybe you open it up to some different people to see that was deployed. Other than that, you basically have been deploying daily all along the way. And so it doesn't, in that sense, doesn't cost you more time or resources to do a build at the end of a sprint because that stuff's already been absorbed and is automated and ready to go. You may have heard of site reliability or SRE. This is, it's more about reliability and stability within systems. It's very much a Google concept, something that came out of the world of Google. And it is, while it started back in the 2000s, before DevOps was really coined, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of areas where SRE and DevOps are basically the same. The difference is DevOps is focused on the entire life cycle. SRE is really more about us being able to have an environment. It doesn't have to be production. It could be a test environment, but having an environment that is reliable, that is reproducible, that is scalable. So we have some of the same things. We will have infrastructure as code. That way, if we have a server that goes down in our environment, we can have a monitoring. Remember, that's another one of the pieces. There's something monitoring it, sees that that server is going down, or maybe is about to go down, and can spin up another server in its place and get us closer to the 5 or 6 nines of reliability, or maybe 100% availability, because we can always see what's going on and spin up another server and we're off and running. So DevOps works very well in the SRE world. Sysops. Now, Sysops is really more where like site reliability is about keeping an environment up, reliable, scalable, stable. Sysops is system operations. This is like the ops side, really, of the DevOps side. So it's more about monitoring and responding to issues with an environment, typically production. And again, while Sysops does a lot of, typically has sort of a manual kind of stuff, there may be some automated monitoring, but it's much more human intervention is involved to spin up a system, to bring one down, to redirect things, to note that there's errors occurring, things like that. DevOps makes Sysops work better. It takes a lot of the human interaction and possibility for human error out of the equation. So now we've got things that are much more automated, that are communicating in code as opposed to people having to communicate with each other. So you have all these processes, you have this, really it's this infrastructure around your platform that allows you to be confident that it's up, that it's not, when it goes down, usually to put something, replace that piece sooner rather than later. And then regardless of the methodology you use, DevOps can be an add-on. When you think particularly about some of the, back up a little bit here, when you think of particularly about a couple of these things, build automation, CI/CD, infrastructure as code, even configuration management, but particularly those first three, even if you have your own little standalone development environment, there is value in being able to rebuild that quickly, to know what it is, to be able to share that with somebody else, infrastructure as code, that you can, whatever your approach is, whatever methodology you're working in, DevOps is something that is worth considering. It is something that can make you better at doing that thing, whatever your methodology happens to be. So particularly when you're thinking about Waterfall and Agile, even like rapid application development, if you do like a RAD approach, that is, again, a perfect way, a perfect fit for DevOps, for that CI/CD, so that we can put something in front of users, we can make some changes, and we can turn that around quickly and say, okay, does this work? Or given this, now what changes are needed? So there's a lot of ways that DevOps can fit into our world. So let's look at some of the pros and cons, the benefits and the concerns that we may have, because they're not necessarily pros and cons because it's not really whether you can use it or not. It's more about this is what it provides us, and here's some things we need to watch out for.